They say all's fair in love and war, but is it? What happens to the cheaters, users, and abusers? Do they get their just dues? And are things always the way they appear? That's just part of what we're going to explore right now in part 3 of our spotlight on the vamps of the 1920s romance movies. So stick around, I've got some surprises in store for you. Hi, welcome back to 100 Years of Romance, a decade-by-decade look at sex, love, and romance on the silver screen. This is Cinema Rolls, your go-to channel for movie comparisons, and I'm your host, Basha. In this video, we're going to continue our breakdown of those sultry and oh-so-venomous vixens from the silent films of the 1920s, the Vamps. If you remember, in parts 1 and 2, we saw who and what the Vamps were, how they lured their victims, the almost supernatural hold they had over men, how they manipulate men to get what they want, and the devastating impact that vamps have on the lives of others. If you missed those videos, you want to click on the links in the description and check them out. Now, in part 3, we're going to take a peek at their backstories, whether or not they evolve or show any personal growth over time, and how their stories end. And we're going to wrap things up by comparing the vamp with the other two types of leading lady we've talked about in this series, the flapper and the good girl. In part 2, we already saw what a mess the vamp usually leaves in her wake and how their victims seem to be able to forgive them everything. But can we, the viewer, forgive them as well? Are there ever any mitigating circumstances? Is a vamp ever a victim herself? How did she get to be the way she is? In the words of Theda Bara, the actress who first brought the vamp to the silver screen, "The vampire I play is the vengeance of my sex upon its exploiters. I have the face of a vampire, but the heart of a feminist." Do the stories of the 1920s vamp movies bear this out? The short answer is sometimes. There are definitely some self-serving, greedy, opportunistic, and even malicious vamps who, at least as far as we know from what's been revealed of their stories, don't seem to have any excuse for their behavior. But then there are the stories where things are not quite so black and white, and those gray areas make for a much more compelling story. For example, in the 1921 movie Sappho, Pola Negri's character, who supposedly drove a man insane with her hold over him, complains to her pimp, "Sold and sold again. I'm sick of it. I want to be free." Up until this point, we have no idea that she's a kept woman. We're led to believe that she's acting on her own volition. And that guy that she supposedly drove insane? He lost his mind simply because he found out about her situation. He created an image of her, fell in love with it, and when she didn't live up to it, he couldn't handle it. We get a glimpse of the kind of life she really yearns for in this scene where she's vacationing on the beach with Richard, the brother of the insane man who has also fallen under her spell. This theme of vamps being pimped out is repeated time and time again in different movies. In the 1929 German film Pandora's Box, that funny little man who's always hanging around Lulu, especially when she's doing well financially, turns out to be her father. Turns out he's also her pimp. Not that he forces her into anything, but his charming little way of implying that he would like her to buy him this or that leaves her as a devoted daughter to do whatever she needs to do to make him happy. At first, that means getting set up as Dr. Schön's kept woman and taking side hustles, literally, to supplement her income. Later, when she's on the run from the law, her stage manager, Rodrigo, sees her as a paycheck and tries to sell her to an Egyptian man who wants to take her back to Cairo with him. And when she escapes from Rodrigo and is living in poverty with her father and Alva, the son of the man she accidentally killed, it's her work that manages to put food on the table. Does she find that happy ending she's looking for? And are the men in her life ever satisfied with what she gives them? In just a few minutes, we'll see how her story ends one Christmas Eve. In the 1929 musical Hallelujah, starring Nina Mae McKinney, the relationship between Chick and her con artist partner Hotshot isn't quite clear. Is he using her? Is she using him? Or are they using each other? One thing we do know is that she finally does assert her independence from him. And he eventually tracks her down and comes looking for her in a way that suggests he's not really capable of making it on his own. In The Woman Men Yearn For, starring Marlene Dietrich, Stasha's background is also unclear. We know she's had Dr. Karoff kill her husband, but we don't know her motivation. Was she being abused, or was it simple greed? We also know that even though she hasn't actually been abducted, as she told Henry, there does seem to be something keeping her with Karoff against her will. He's obviously smitten with her, but her contempt for and fear of him is written all over her face. Perhaps the most tragic of all the Vamp stories is the 1926 film The Temptress, starring Greta Garbo. Here's a woman who's caused more destruction than any of our other Vamps. Men have died for her, fought duels for her, and lost fortunes because of her, and property has been destroyed and the environment damaged, all because of her. Because of her. When Robledo confronts her saying, "Men have died for you, forsaken their work for you," she answers, "Because of me, yes, but not for me, for my body, not for my happiness, but for theirs." And she explains that her husband sold her to the banker Fontenoy for financial gain. If we look back on the story, we begin to see how true this is. Early on, we saw her telling Fontenoy in no uncertain terms that she would never love him. She wasn't leading him on, but he persisted because he wanted her for his own pleasure. Just before Fontenoy poisoned himself at the banquet, he told everyone, "We were discreet. We pretended her husband bought her the jewels." And true to form, once Fontenoy was dead, all Elena's husband has to say to her is, "Now how am I going to pay my debts?" Likewise, Manos Duras fought the duel with Robledo because he wanted to possess her for his own pleasure. She didn't even know him. And Robledo himself fought the duel not to protect her honor, but to maintain control of his property. Elena's husband died in the crossfire of the conflict between Manos Duras and Robledo, fought because of her, but not because of anything she did. And the duel that was fought over her at the fiesta was not instigated by anything she did either, but because two men that she barely knew wanted to possess her for her physical beauty. Did Elena ask for all this chaos to follow her across the globe? We do have to admit that she deceived Robledo when she first met him at the masquerade and told him she was free to love him. But knowing what we know now, we can perhaps understand why she considered herself to be free. She was ready and willing to walk away from the terrible life she had and start over again. She was looking for an escape. In fact, this scene shows the kind of life she really wanted. All this doesn't excuse the lie, but it does explain it. I think more than any of the other Vamp movies, The Temptress, with its tongue-in-cheek title, conveys how the mere fact of a woman's physical beauty often incites men to dishonor her, abandon their ethics, and or commit acts of violence either against her or over her, and then blame her for the fallout. Almost as if they literally cannot control themselves in the presence of such overpowering beauty. Why do I say that The Temptress is a tongue-in-cheek title? Because in most cases, the only thing Elena does to tempt anyone is to be beautiful. How dare she? As we've seen, even the more innocent of our temptresses do have moments when their behavior is not really on the up and up. But do they ever learn from their mistakes or show any personal growth over the course of their stories? Again, the answer is sometimes. In The Temptress, Robledo finally tells Elena, "You've beaten me, I'll go anywhere with you." It's what she's been praying for all along. But she slips away the next morning and heads back to Paris, leaving him a note saying only, "To love me would destroy you." She's internalized what he told her earlier and what the world seems to think of her, that she's a woman who brings ruin to every man she comes across. But her love for Robledo is real, and she doesn't want to bring him down. In the 1926 film Flesh and the Devil, Herta begs Felicitas to stop the duel that Leo and Ulrich are about to fight over her. At first, Felicitas doesn't want to hear it and even seems to be tortured by Herta's prayers, like a vampire being confronted with a crucifix. But she finally relents and runs out to find them. Does she reach them in time? We'll pick this story back up in just a little while. In Hallelujah, Chick is moved by Zeke's preaching and repents her evil ways, seeming to undergo a religious transformation, even though she'd just been jeering at him a few moments earlier. But that doesn't stop her from luring him away from his congregation and his new fiancée and setting up housekeeping with him in another town. The next time we meet up with her, she seems to be content with her life with Zeke as a happy homemaker. That is, until her old partner Hotshot shows up and convinces her to run off with him. Does she redeem herself in the end? Stay tuned to find out. In the 1929 German film Asphalt, although Betty has used sexual manipulation as a get-out-of-jail-free card, it seems that she's developed genuine feelings for her arresting officer Albert Holk. Because when she learns that he's been arrested for murder, she goes to the police station and testifies that he killed in self-defense. And then she confesses to her own crimes. Now we come to the moment where we talk about how the Vamps wrap their stories up. And let me just warn you, there are no happy endings here. The lucky ones just end up being alone. In the 1927 film Sunrise, which we talked about in part 1, we see the woman from the city riding off in a horse-drawn wagon back to the city, her hopes of returning there with her lover from the seaside village dashed. And in the 1920 movie Sex, starring Louise Glaum, which we also talked about in part 1, Adrienne seems to have gotten her wish. She's now married to a rich man and has given up the stage, but now she's the one who sits at home while her husband's dick goes out every night. Her husband Dick goes out every night. Or did I mean that? Dick takes up with Daisy, who's made a big name for herself on the stage. Daisy was Adrienne's young protege when she was on the stage. When Adrienne confronts her, Daisy laughs and reminds Adrienne of the advice she'd given her before. Grab everything you can get and never feel sorry for anyone but yourself. When Adrienne's husband walks in, the confrontation mirrors what happened when Philip Overton's wife had confronted Adrienne. In the end, Dick leaves Adrienne and she boards an ocean liner to get away from it all. While on board, she sees her former lover Philip Overton, who's on his second honeymoon, and although we can't be sure, there does seem to be some glimmering of understanding that she's brought her loneliness on herself. Betty from Asphalt is not quite so lucky. She's arrested for her crimes and heads off to jail, but Albert tells her he'll wait for her, so maybe she'll have a happy ending after all. Who knows? A lot can happen while a girl is sitting in jail, and it doesn't seem to take much for him to fall in love. Just saying. One of the more common themes of the Vamp movies is strangulation, and although it doesn't always lead to physical death, it does lead to the death of the relationship. In Sunrise, the husband first attempts to strangle the woman from the city when she suggests that he kill his wife, but she manages to calm him down with a little sex. The second time he tries to strangle her is when he thinks his wife is dead and he blames her. But he drops her when he hears that his wife's been found alive. In The Temptress, Robledo is so infuriated with all the destruction that he blames on Elena, and I think also for his repressed attraction to her, that he tries to strangle her. And she surrenders completely because she's convinced that the world would be better off without her too. But in the end, he can't go through with it. In Flesh and the Devil, Felicitas has a proposition for Leo. Instead of running away together as they'd planned, Why not have an affair right under Ulrich's nose? Because, as she says, she can't walk away from all of this, meaning Ulrich's wealth. The idea is so infuriating to Leo that he starts wringing her neck until he is caught in the act by Ulrich, who challenges him to a duel. And while Sappho is in her dressing room with the jealous Richard, his brother Andreas, who has escaped from the lunatic asylum, comes in and strangles her to death for not being the woman he had built up in his mind. And, as it turns out, the Wicked Witch of the West was not the only movie villainess to be obliterated by water.
I'm melting! Melting! Oh!
In Flesh and the Devil, Felicitas finally gets in touch with her conscience, and she goes out to stop the duel between Leo and Ulrich, but she doesn't quite make it. At the moment she drowns, they instinctively stop their duel, as if a veil has been lifted and her malignant spell has died with her. The Vamps almost always have a violent ending, as we see in Pandora's Box, where Lulu is living in poverty in London with her father and Alva. When a man on the street tries to proposition her, Alva comes to her rescue, but her father remarks, "Pity, I would have liked to have tasted Christmas pudding once more in my life." And here we really see Lulu's true spirit of generosity, because even though the streets aren't safe at night, she goes out looking for work to make his wish come true. She finds a prospect, but when he tells her he doesn't have any money, she invites him in anyway because she likes him. I'd say that's taking kindness to strangers and the Christmas spirit to a whole new level. But kindness is not always rewarded. And her father enjoys his Christmas pudding, blissfully unaware that she gave her all for it. In the 1920 movie Sumeroon, which we looked at in part 1, the sheik wakes up from his lovemaking session with Yanaya and catches her with his son. The only one to really mourn her death is the hunchback from the traveling carnival that she always took so much for granted. We'll see a bit more of his story in our video on the underdogs of love. In Hallelujah, Chick's story ends when Zeke finds out that Chick is running off with Hotshot.
That old devil's coming closer now. And I was getting more scared all the time. The chick's done gone to the devil. I was scared, Brother Zeke. I was scared to meet the Lord. So scared. Oh.
So it seems that even though she wasn't able to stay on the straight and narrow, she has at least developed a conscience. In The Woman Men Yearned For, Karov and Stasha are arrested for the murder of her husband, and with nothing left to lose, Karov shoots her. This is when Henry, who has just abandoned his own bride on their wedding night in order to help her, tells her that he loves her in spite of everything. For me, the saddest ending of all is in The Temptress. 6 years after Elena leaves Argentina, Robledo returns to Paris as a celebrated engineer with his new wife in tow. He spots Elena in the crowd that's gathered to welcome him back and follows her to a cafe. It's apparent that she's down and out, and he tries to help her financially, but she pretends not to recognizing him, saying only, "I meet so many men." And I think we all know what that means. She seems completely broken. It's only after he leaves and she kisses the ruby ring he'd given her all those years ago that we understand she really does recognize him, and she still doesn't want to cause him any problems. When she gives the ruby ring to a tramp in whom she sees the face of Jesus, it's clear that her end is near. Before we wrap things up, I'd like to draw some comparisons between the Vamps and the other two types of leading ladies that we've looked at in this series, the flappers and the good girls. Surprisingly, I found more similarities between the Vamps and the Good Girls than I did between the Vamps and the Flappers. While the Good Girls are very passive when it comes to their love lives, to the point of agreeing to arrange marriages with men they don't love, the Flappers, as we saw, are much more proactive when it comes to attracting a mate. And although the Vamps can be either active or passive when it comes to choosing, once they've met a man they're attracted to, they consider themselves to be in love and have a very fatalistic attitude toward everything that happens as they're pursuing their goal. They don't consider themselves to be subject to the same rules that apply to everyone else. Their passion exempts them from any responsibility for the consequences of their behavior. They can also be very passive when it comes to their own fate. For example, when we saw Sappho disarm her jealous lover with only the strength of her will, it seemed that she had the upper hand. But we later learn that she's being exploited by that very same man, partly against her will and partly with her own complicity, because of her love of the good life and beautiful things. Another thing the Vamps and the Good Girls have in common is the type of men they become involved with. While the Flappers generally fell for wholesome boy-next-door types, including rich boys next door, the Good Girls were mostly involved with heroes and villains, which goes hand in hand with their passive nature. The Vamp, on the other hand, always seems to be looking for a hero, but what she ends up with are villains and victims. She's often exploited by the men in her life, but she tends to balance that out by victimizing or exploiting other men, and this is what I mean when I say she's looking for a hero, often in the form of a sugar daddy, and if her sugar daddy has become a villain, either in reality or because she's done with him, then she looks for someone else to rescue her on an emotional level, and it's these men who become her super passive and utterly manipulable victims. The Good Girl reflects this cycle of victimization, but she's only ever on the receiving end. She doesn't victimize anyone. It's only the Flapper who's never a victim or victimizer. She may be widely misunderstood because her fun-loving outsides don't match her big-hearted insides and semi-traditional values, but she doesn't internalize other people's opinions and she doesn't let her get her down. And while there are those who try to take advantage of the Flapper, she knows how to handle them. And while the Flapper and the Vamp often date outside their socioeconomic class, the Vamp is purposely dipping into that pool in order to increase her status and wealth. But the Flapper happens upon it by chance and often isn't even aware of her beau status in her rags to riches story, at least at first. The Good Girls generally date within their own class, but their happy endings are about a different kind of wealth. It's that brass ring known as true love and is sometimes served up with a side of deliverance from their unfortunate circumstances, as we saw in Seventh Heaven. Although the Flappers and Good Girls usually enjoy a happy ending, this isn't always the case. And when their endings are unhappy, this is where we see the starkest contrast between the two types. When the Good Girls are deprived of an acceptable solution, they often choose to end it all, as we saw in The Toll of the Sea and Eternal Love. But the Flapper just picks herself up, dusts herself off, and makes up her mind to be happy with the hand that life has dealt her, as we saw in Lady of the Night and Die Bergkatze, where it's evident that happiness of others is more important to both of these women than their own happiness. The Flappers are just better equipped to deal with their own unhappiness and get on with life than the Good Girls are. The Vamp is the only type of leading lady who consistently has a tragic or violent ending. And if we could look deeply enough into their stories, I'm sure that, for most of them, we could find a life of abuse and exploitation that has left them empty and unable to love, which explains why love can't save them. Instead, sex, love, and romance are just a means to an end, and that's why I think the Vamp was the prototype for the femme fatale of film noir from the 1940s and 50s. So much so that we're planning to do another video comparing the two. But next in the series, we're going to start in on the different types of leading men of the 1920s, starting with a type that I like to call the underdogs of love. It may not sound very glamorous, but believe it or not, some of the most touching and poignant romance films of the 20s feature this type. After that, we're going to follow up with a look at the heroes and villains and the Latin lovers. So be sure to subscribe and hit that bell notification button so you're sure to catch every episode. See you next time. Until then, try some more cinema rolls. They're good for you.